Welcome back. We are here for section 4 and 5 of the contract. We're going to put both of these together because they both deal with the closing date. So getting started, it's two pretty short paragraphs you'll see here. And essentially, unless there's a problem, this is your closing date. Now there are certain, that's the goal is to get there, of course. But some people will write in what in that line?
On or before, which doesn't make any sense, really.
Yeah, it's tough. I think the reason why people do that is that they are hopeful that they can move their closing date up. Maybe the parties would love to close in 30 days, but they're going to put 45 days. They're going to put on or before whatever the date of the 45th day is after your effective date. But in reality, there are deadlines throughout the contract that run from the closing date. So you need a specific closing date in order to know when your title evidence is due and a few other items. So we really think that, you have to be careful here. If you see on or before, I always cross it out. I always put a specific date in. And again, it's up to the agents to have a conversation and say, hey, if we can move it up, we'll move it up.
Yeah, and you can easily do that with drafting the addendum.
Mm-hmm. Not later crossing it off and changing it as we talked about.
We covered that in the previous episode.
Yeah, exactly. So the closing date is here, right under that, and you'll see on every page there's places to initial for the buyer and seller there at the bottom. And essentially your closing date is the day on which everyone is going to get together, sign up on the paperwork. Sometimes you sign up on paperwork prior to your actual closing date, but that's when everything is going to be effectively done and money is going to change hands.
Yeah. So, this is fairly simple. Now, things get a little complicated if the closing date has to be extended. It depends on the circumstances as to why they're getting extended. Now, I remember our first closing, we were looking forward to a hurricane potentially running right through where the property was, and the property would not be there. So Meg was reviewing the contract very thoroughly to understand, what happens in that instance.
Yeah, absolutely. We live in Florida after all. So hurricanes and storms and power outages as a result of that are going to happen. And those are really kind of covered by Section B. Section A here, these are essentially forced extensions. These are things that the parties wouldn't otherwise agree to, but the contract identifies that these are instances where you may need to extend the closing date. So the first has to do with the CFPB requirements, which really boils down to if a buyer has a lender, the lender is going to provide a closing disclosure 72 hours, 3 days before the closing. If they fail to meet that deadline, then you'll have to move the closing date back so that there's still 72 hours or 3 days that the buyers had a chance to fully review that closing disclosure and sign off on it. So it's a consumer protection deadline, essentially, and it really doesn't come into play if you're dealing with a cash deal. But if you do have a lender, it becomes really important to make sure that even if you're working for the seller, by the time you're getting close to closing, you should have had contact with the buyer's lender at some point.
Absolutely.
We always check in with them, make sure everything's looking good. But certainly if you're getting to 4 days before closing, at least reaching out and making sure that they're getting that CD to the buyer the next day so no one is going to be extending closing. That can become extremely important if your seller needs to sell this place and is buying another one on the same day. Things like that. So this will automatically force you to move your closing date if it's not met. And then we've got Section B, which is what Serge was mentioning in terms of force majeure. So that's in quotation marks. It is defined in the contract, which I did read very closely a few times on that first deal. Like what happens to the property? Does the buyer have to buy it if it's damaged? All that sort of stuff. It's in there. You can read it to fall asleep if you want. But ultimately here, if the utilities are off or you can't get them switched, or frankly, if the closing whoever's doing the closing, the title office isn't open that day, which many people did deal with. That was Hurricane Irma. There were plenty of title offices that were closed. They didn't have power. So that's going to allow you to move the closing date. And it basically gets extended as provided in Standard G, which is further down there.
Yeah, and we will review that language as well, because the purpose of this course is to actually just, get through it. There'll be sections that you could just read the disclosure statements yourself. We're not going to read them out loud, but everything is addressed over here. But the idea here, so you know how to navigate the contract. You know if something's happening, where to find the information, so that way you know how to solve the problem.
Yep. That's right. So hopefully you don't have to extend your closing. Hopefully you get a close on the closing date, not on or before, but on it. And again, if you have to make any changes to that, do it through an addendum. But if you have any questions on this section, just let us know.
All right. We will look forward to seeing you guys in our next episode.
Thanks.